There is a collection of clay tablets in the Mesopotamian Gallery of the British Museum, recovered from the ruins of the Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, that contain the most complete set of ritual instructions to survive from the ancient world. They are approximately 2,600 years old. They prescribe, in precise Akkadian cuneiform, a sequence of ceremonies to be performed over 12 days at the turn of the new year. The tablets are small enough to hold in 2 hands. The instructions they carry have outlived every empire that ever performed them. They describe purifications, recitations, animal offerings, and processions through specific temple gates in a specific order, addressed to a specific god. The god named on these tablets is Marduk, patron deity of Babylon. But the tablets themselves contain evidence, recognized by mainstream Assyriology, that these ceremonies were not originally written for Marduk at all. They were composed centuries earlier, in Sumerian, for different gods entirely. The rituals were kept, the recipient was changed. And what happened after that change, what it means that the forms survived but the addressee did not, is a question that has not been answered seriously by any published academic study. The tablets belong to what scholars call the Akitu festival tradition, the Babylonian New Year ceremony, and they represent one of the most extensively documented liturgical sequences in the ancient Near East. The physical objects date to the 7th century BCE, copied by scribes working under the reign of Ashurbanipal, the last great king of the Assyrian Empire. But the ritual tradition they preserve is far older. Thorkild Jacobsen, professor of Assyriology at Harvard University and later at the University of Chicago, traced the structural elements of the Akitu back to Sumerian prototypes from approximately 2100 BCE, nearly 1500 years before the Nineveh copies were made. Jacobsen documented this continuity in his landmark study The Treasures of Darkness, published by Yale University Press in 1976. What he found was that the core ritual architecture, the sequence of purifications, the spatial movement through sacred precincts, the timing relative to equinox, had been preserved with remarkable fidelity across more than a millennium of transmission. The names had changed, the structure had not. The Sumerian originals addressed Enlil, the chief deity of the Nippur pantheon, and in some variations Enki, the god of water, wisdom, and the creation of humanity, whose temple at Eridu is the oldest known sacred structure in Mesopotamia, dating to approximately 5400 BCE. When Babylon rose to political dominance under Hammurabi around 1792 BCE, a theological revolution accompanied the political one. Marduk, Babylon's local patron, was elevated above all other gods. The vehicle for this elevation was a text that still sits in the British Museum. It is called the Enuma Elish. And the mechanism it describes is not subtle. It is an explicit, documented, point-by-point transfer of divine authority from the older gods to Marduk. The Enuma Elish assigns Marduk 50 names. Each name is an attribute, a power, a domain of authority that previously belonged to another deity. The text does not hide this. It narrates it as triumph. Marduk receives the powers of Enlil. Marduk receives the powers of Ea, the Akkadian name for Enki. Marduk receives jurisdiction over the fates, over the calendar, over the temple rites. W.G. Lambert, professor of Assyriology at the University of Birmingham and the foremost authority on Babylonian creation literature, spent decades documenting this transfer. His posthumous work Babylonian Creation Myths, published by Eisenbrauns in 2013, remains the definitive study. Lambert demonstrated that the Enuma Elish was not simply a creation myth, it was a political theology. It was the charter document for a wholesale reassignment of ritual practice from the gods who had originally received it to the god whose city now held power. The rituals did not change, the prayers did not change, the offerings did not change. The name at the top of the address changed, and with that change, every ceremony that had been performed for Enlil at Nippur, every water rite that had been performed for Enki at Eridu, every invocation that had named a specific deity for a specific function, was redirected. The form was preserved. The recipient was replaced. This much is not disputed. Lambert documented it. Jacobsen documented it. Bottéro documented it. The transfer is mainstream scholarship. But there is a second layer to this material that mainstream scholarship has not addressed, and it centers on a concept that appears repeatedly in the Sumerian textual record. The Sumerians called them the Me. The Me are typically translated as divine powers or divine offices, a set of fundamental civilizational capacities that the gods held and distributed. Kramer translated the composition known as Enki and the world order, in which Enki assigns the Me to various deities, each Me governing a specific domain. Kingship is a Me, priesthood is a Me, the art of metalworking is a Me, the calendar is a Me, sexual intercourse is a Me, truth is a Me, the descent into the underworld is a Me. Kramer catalogued over 100 of them. In the conventional reading, the Me are abstract theological concepts, categories of civilizational function attributed to divine origin. But Zecharia Sitchin, the independent researcher who published The 12th Planet in 1976 and spent over 30 years analyzing Sumerian and Akkadian texts, read the Me differently. Sitchin argued that the Me were not abstract categories but operational protocols, specific sets of instructions and capabilities that the Anunnaki distributed among themselves to manage the infrastructure of early human civilization. In Sitchin's reading, when Marduk absorbed the Me of the older gods through the Enuma Elish, he did not merely inherit symbolic titles, he took control of operational systems. And when the rituals associated with those systems continued to be performed, but were now addressed to Marduk instead of their original holders, something functionally changed. The procedures continued, the intended operator did not receive them, the rituals became, in Sitchin's framework, a transmission aimed at the wrong receiver, and what is striking, what this entire investigation rests on, is that many of those ritual forms did not die with Babylon. They did not die with Assyria, they did not die with the Persian Empire. Structural elements of those ceremonies are still performed today, in traditions that have long since forgotten where the forms originated or whom they were originally meant to reach. If you find that the academic literature on artifacts like this has been incomplete, if you suspect there are ritual texts still sitting in museum collections that have been read as symbolic when they may have been operational, this channel is for that work. Subscribe only if that is the question you have been looking for. The rest of us continue. The conventional reading of this material is well established and internally consistent. Samuel Noah Kramer, Clark Research Professor of Assyriology at the University of Pennsylvania and the most prolific translator of Sumerian literary texts in the 20th century, documented the Sumerian ritual corpus across dozens of publications, most accessibly in History Begins at Sumer, first published in 1956, and The Sumerians, published in 1963. Kramer treated the ritual tablets as expressions of religious belief, liturgical scripts for a priestly class that managed the relationship between human communities and their divine patrons. In this reading, the rituals are symbolic. The purification rites represent spiritual cleansing. The offerings represent gratitude and supplication. The processions represent the cosmic order made visible in civic space. The Akitu ceremonies, documented in tablets dating to the 7th century BCE, are read as expressions of a theological worldview, not as operational procedures. When the addressee changed from Enlil to Marduk, the conventional view holds that this was a natural consequence of political transition. Cities rise and fall, their gods rise and fall with them. The rituals adapted because religious systems adapt. Jean Bottéro, professor at the École pratique des hautes études in Paris, and one of the most respected historians of Mesopotamian religion, articulated this position in Religion in Ancient Mesopotamia, published in 2001. Bottéro described the theological transition as a process of syncretism, the blending and absorption of older traditions into newer theological frameworks. Leo Oppenheim, professor of Assyriology at the University of Chicago, had offered a similar framework in Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization, published in 1964. Oppenheim characterized Mesopotamian religion as a system of civic management, in which the gods functioned as institutional authorities and their rituals as administrative procedures for maintaining cosmic and social order. In this view, changing the god's name was analogous to changing the name on a government office. The function continues, the office holder rotates, There is an internal logic to this position that should not be dismissed. Mesopotamian temples were economic institutions as much as they were religious ones. The Temple of Enlil at Nippur administered agricultural land, managed labor forces, and collected surplus grain. The rituals performed within the temple complex served institutional functions, reinforcing the authority of the priestly class, marking the agricultural calendar, and distributing resources according to a schedule that the community understood as divinely sanctioned. When the administering deity changed from Enlil to Marduk, the institutional functions continued because the institution continued. The grain still needed to be collected. The calendar still needed to be marked. The social hierarchy still needed its ritual reinforcement. Oppenheim described this as the care and feeding of the gods, a phrase he used as a chapter title, in which the daily rituals of washing, clothing, and feeding the divine statue were understood as maintaining the god's presence in the community, and therefore maintaining the community's access to divine favor. The conventional reading does not ask whether the original addressee mattered in a way that the replacement could not fulfill, because within the symbolic framework, the question does not arise. A symbol can be reassigned, a function can be transferred. The office continues regardless of who holds it. It is worth noting that not every ancient civilization shared this assumption. The Vedic ritual tradition of India, developed independently of Mesopotamian contact, treats the identity of the divine addressee as a non-negotiable structural parameter. That parallel will be examined in full later, but it is relevant here because it suggests the symbolic framework is not the only framework available, and that other civilizations reached a different conclusion about whether the name at the top of the address matters. The question only becomes urgent if the rituals were not symbolic, if the ME were not abstract categories but specific instructions designed for specific recipients, and if the identity of the recipient was not interchangeable but essential to the operation. The break in this conventional reading came not from within Assyriology, but from outside it. Sitchin, who had studied economics and journalism at the London School of Economics before turning to independent research in ancient languages, spent decades working through the Sumerian and Akkadian textual corpus with a different set of assumptions. He taught himself to read cuneiform by cross-referencing published sign lists against the transliterations and translations provided by academic Assyriologists. His method was not that of a trained philologist. It was that of a systematic outsider, working from the published record, applying the tools of textual analysis to material that the Academy had already translated, but, in his view, had not fully interpreted. His starting point was a question that mainstream scholarship had never needed to ask, because the symbolic framework made it unnecessary. The question was this: if the ME are operational, if they describe real procedures and real capacities rather than theological abstractions, then the identity of the operator matters. A set of instructions addressed to Enki for the management of water systems is not the same as a set of instructions addressed to Marduk for the management of water systems if Enki is the entity who designed the water system, and Marduk is a later claimant who absorbed the title without the operational knowledge. Sitchin laid out this framework across multiple volumes of the Earth Chronicles, beginning with the 12th Planet in 1976, and continuing through The Stairway to Heaven in 1980, The Wars of Gods and Men in 1985, and The Lost Realms in 1990. Each volume built on the last, and the ME interpretation developed in sophistication across the series. By the time of the Cosmic Code, published in 1998, Sitchin had compiled what amounted to a systematic alternative reading of the entire Sumerian institutional framework, treating the ME not as theological abstractions, but as a distributed operating system for civilization. He argued that the Anunnaki were not symbolic deities but physical beings, and that the ME they distributed were not metaphors but functional assignments. The distinction is critical. In the conventional reading, when the Enuma Elish describes Marduk receiving the ME of Enlil, this is a literary device, a theological narrative expressing political reality. The older gods' powers are absorbed as metaphor, but Sitchin pointed to the specificity of the ME lists themselves. The ME of kingship includes detailed protocols for the administration of justice, the collection of tribute, and the organization of labor. The emi of the priesthood includes specific instructions for the preparation of offerings, the timing of ceremonies relative to celestial events, and the maintenance of sacred spaces. The emi of metalworking includes references to smelting techniques, alloy compositions, and the temperatures required to work specific materials. These are not the kind of details that a metaphorical system requires. Metaphors do not specify alloy ratios. Symbolic categories do not prescribe offering sequences calibrated to the rising of particular stars. The emi read, Sitchin argued, like technical manuals distributed across departments of a complex organization. And if they were technical manuals, then the identity of the department head matters. A procedure designed for one operator and handed to another does not necessarily function the same way. The operator's knowledge, authority, and relationship to the system are part of the procedure. This is not a reading that has been adopted by any mainstream Assyriologist, but here is what should concern anyone who cares about the integrity of the scholarly process. It has not been refuted either, not specifically, not on the ME. The dismissal has taken the form of general characterization, labeling Sitchin's work as pseudoscience or ancient astronaut theory, without a published engagement with his specific interpretation of the ME system as operational rather than symbolic. Michael S. Heiser, the scholar of Hebrew Bible and Semitic languages, who held a PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and who devoted significant effort to critiquing Sitchin's linguistic claims, focused primarily on Sitchin's readings of individual Sumerian and Akkadian words and his interpretation of planetary references in the Enuma Elish. Heiser did valuable work in identifying places where Sitchin's translations departed from standard Assyriological consensus, but Heiser did not publish a specific analysis of Sitchin's ME interpretation. The operational versus symbolic question remained unaddressed, and the ME system is not a peripheral element of Sumerian civilization. It is, by the testimony of the texts themselves, the foundational organizational framework. Kramer catalogued ME related to agriculture, animal husbandry, construction, irrigation, jurisprudence, musicianship, scribal arts, leatherworking, copperworking, and dozens of other domains. The composition Inanna and Enki, in which the goddess Inanna tricks Enki into giving her the ME of Eridu and transports them to her city of Uruk, lists the ME in such specific operational detail that the text reads less like a myth and more like a cargo manifest. Inanna takes the ME of the throne of kingship, the exalted scepter, the royal insignia, shepherdship, the art of the hero, the art of the forthright, the art of the treacherous, the art of kindness, the art of travel, the art of the secure dwelling place, the craft of the carpenter, the craft of the copper worker, the craft of the scribe, the craft of the leather worker, the craft of the fuller, the craft of the builder, and dozens more. She loads them into a boat. She physically transports them. Kramer translated this text. He noted the extraordinary specificity of the list. He did not ask why a symbolic category would need to be loaded into a boat. The Vedic tradition, independently and without any known textual contact with Mesopotamia, preserved a parallel concept. The Rig Veda insists that a ritual performed with the wrong deity invocation is not merely ineffective, it is dangerous. The concept has a name in Sanskrit. It is called a dosha, a ritual fault. The Vedic priests maintained that precision in deity address was not optional. It was structural. This parallel will become important. Sitchin's reading of the ME transforms the Marduk transfer from a theological curiosity into an operational catastrophe. If the ME assigned to Enki for the management of water, irrigation, and the subterranean aquifer system were operational protocols, then the rituals associated with those ME were designed to be received by a specific entity. They were calibrated to Enki. The purification rites performed at Eridu, the water offerings poured at the Abzu, the invocations chanted over the reed marshes of the southern alluvium. These were not generic prayers. They were addressed communications. They assumed a listener. When the Enuma Elish reassigned those functions to Marduk, the texts continued to prescribe the same actions. The water was still poured, the invocations were still chanted, the temple personnel still processed through the sacred precincts in the prescribed order. But the name at the top of the address had changed, And if Enki was the designed recipient, then Marduk was, in operational terms, the wrong god. The ritual reached no one, or it reached someone who did not hold the operational capacity to act on it. The form survived, the function did not. This is not a small claim. Consider what it would mean for the transmission of ritual across the subsequent 3,000 years. The Akitu festival did not end with Babylon. Elements of it persisted through the Persian period. When Cyrus the Great, after conquering Babylon in 539 BCE, participated in the Akitu rites himself, legitimizing his rule by performing the ceremonies that the Babylonian kings had performed for Marduk. The ritual form was so deeply embedded in the political theology of Mesopotamia that even a foreign conqueror adopted it. But Cyrus did not worship Marduk. He worshipped Ahura Mazda. The Cyrus cylinder, the clay document held in the British Museum that records his conquest of Babylon, describes Cyrus performing the Akitu rites and presenting himself as Marduk's chosen instrument, not because he believed in Marduk, but because the ritual form carried political legitimacy that transcended the specific deity. The ceremony was so powerful as a social technology that a foreign conqueror adopted it wholesale. The form was preserved again. The recipient shifted again. The rituals that had originally been Enlil's, then Marduk's, were now performed by a Zoroastrian king for purposes that had nothing to do with any Mesopotamian deity. And the pattern did not stop there. The water purification rites that trace their structural ancestry to the Enki cult at Eridu, the oldest continuously occupied sacred site in Mesopotamia, have echoes in traditions that span the ancient world. Ritual immersion, ritual pouring, the use of water as a medium of spiritual transition or renewal. The temple of Enki at Eridu sat at the edge of the Abzu, the freshwater aquifer that the Sumerians believed connected to the cosmic underground ocean. Enki was the lord of the Abzu. The rituals performed there were water rituals, and they were specifically his. When those rituals migrated, first to Marduk in Babylon, then through cultural diffusion and theological adaptation into later traditions, the water remained, the pouring remained, the immersion remained. What did not remain was the name of the entity for whom the water was originally poured. Kramer documented the Eridu temple sequence in detail. The earliest occupation levels at Eridu, excavated by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd in the 1940s, revealed a continuous sequence of temple construction dating back to approximately 5,400 BCE, making it the oldest known religious structure in the world. Each rebuilding enlarged the temple, but preserved the same orientation and the same relationship to the water source. The god of that temple was Enki. Every excavation level confirmed it. The offerings found at each level, fish bones, water vessels, traces of ritual libation, were consistent with a water deity cult. The architectural orientation remained constant across 3,000 years of rebuilding. The rituals performed there were Enki's rituals. They were designed for the god who, according to the Sumerian texts, created humanity from clay mixed with the blood of a slain deity, who gave humanity the arts of civilization through the Me, and who intervened to save humanity from the flood by warning Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah, in direct defiance of the other god's decision to destroy the human race. Enki's relationship to humanity, as described in the Atrahasis epic and in Enki and the World Order, is personal, functional, and specific. He is not a generic skyfather. He is the engineer. He designed the system. The rituals addressed to him were not generic worship. They were, in the textual framing, communications to the designer. For over 3,000 years, from approximately 5,400 BCE to approximately 2000 BCE, the water rites at Eridu were addressed to Enki. Then Babylon rose. Then Marduk absorbed Enki's titles. Then the same rites were addressed to Marduk. Then Babylon fell. Then the rites scattered into the theological traditions that inherited fragments of Mesopotamian practice. The water persisted. The name did not. And the water rites did not stay in Mesopotamia. The ritual use of water as a purifying agent, administered by a priestly figure at a designated sacred site, with the participants submerged or anointed as an act of spiritual transition, appears in cultures across the ancient Near East and the Mediterranean. The Mandaeans, a Gnostic community that still practices today in southern Iraq and Iran, perform a baptismal rite called masbuta, in flowing water, and their tradition explicitly traces its origin to the region of the southern Mesopotamian marshes, the territory of Enki's cult. The Mandaean texts name a figure they call Manda de Hayi, knowledge of life, a divine teacher associated with water and wisdom, whose attributes parallel those of Enki with a precision that has been noted by multiple scholars of Gnostic traditions. The Mandaeans have performed this rite continuously for at least 2,000 years. They do not address it to Enki, they do not know Enki's name, but the form of the ritual, water, priestly mediation, spiritual transformation at the boundary between the physical and the sacred, carries the structural fingerprint of the Eridu tradition. The question that has not been asked in any peer-reviewed publication is whether the form alone is sufficient, or whether the identity of the original addressee was a necessary component of the ritual's intended function. The bread and beer offerings follow the same trajectory. The Sumerian temple economy was built on two staples, ninda and kas, bread and beer. These were not merely food items placed before a statue. They were produced according to specific formulas within the temple precinct, by personnel whose roles were defined by the ME system. The bapir, the beer bread used in Sumerian brewing, was prepared according to instructions that scholars found embedded in a hymn to Ninkasi, the goddess of beer, dating to approximately 1800 BCE. The hymn describes the brewing process with such technical precision that modern brewers have used it to reconstruct ancient Sumerian beer. The preparation of the offering was itself ritualized, governed by specific ME and tied to specific deities. Ninkasi held the ME of brewing, Ashnan held the ME of grain. The offering was not an improvised gift placed before a statue. It was a product of a system in which every component, the grain, the fermentation, the vessel, the timing, was assigned to a specific divine domain. The offering of bread and fermented drink to a deity was a core Sumerian ritual act. It predates Babylon, it predates the Marduk transfer, and it survives, in structural form, in liturgical traditions practiced today across multiple continents, in rituals whose participants do not know that the bread they break and the cup they raise echo a ceremony that was originally addressed to a Sumerian deity in a reed temple at the edge of the southern marshes. The persistence is remarkable. A ritual form originating in a Sumerian temple economy, involving the offering of bread and fermented drink to a named deity, survived the collapse of Sumer, the rise and fall of Babylon, the Persian conquest, the Hellenistic period, and the Roman transformation of Near Eastern religion. At each stage, the deity receiving the offering changed. The offering did not. The bread remained bread, the drink remained drink. The act of offering remained the central gesture. Only the name spoken over the offering changed, and eventually the participants forgot that any other name had ever been spoken. The sacred marriage is perhaps the most striking survival. The hieros gamos, the ritual union between a human representative and a divine figure, was central to the cult of Inanna, the Sumerian goddess of sexuality, warfare, and political power. Inanna held specific ME related to sexual union, and the sacred marriage rite enacted those ME in ceremonial form. The king of a Sumerian city-state would ritually consummate a union with a priestess representing Inanna, and this act was understood as renewing the fertility of the land, the legitimacy of the king, and the bond between the human community and the divine order. Jacobsen analyzed the sacred marriage texts extensively and found that the ritual was Inanna-specific. It was not performed for other goddesses. It was calibrated to her ME, her specific domain of divine authority. When the theological transfer occurred and elements of Inanna's cult were absorbed into later traditions, the ritual form of sacred union persisted in various guises, but the deity for whom the union was performed was no longer Inanna. The form survived. The intended divine participant did not. The sacred marriage rite was performed at the top of the ziggurat, in a specially prepared chamber, with specific offerings of food and drink, specific textiles on the ritual bed, and specific hymns chanted by the attending priestesses. The hymns addressed Inanna by name. They described her arrival, her pleasure, her bestowal of kingship and fertility upon the human partner. When elements of this rite migrated into later Semitic traditions, and eventually into the mystical branches of Abrahamic religion, the structural form of sacred union between the human and the divine persisted, but the identity of the divine partner was replaced, reinterpreted, or spiritualized beyond recognition. The Song of Songs in the Hebrew Bible, which describes an intimate union between lovers using language that echoes Sumerian sacred marriage poetry, has been read by mainstream biblical scholarship as either secular love poetry or an allegory of the relationship between God and Israel. What it has not been read as, except by scholars willing to trace its structural ancestry, is a distant descendant of a ritual originally performed for Inanna at the summit of the Inanna temple in Uruk, approximately 4,000 years ago. What Sitchin's framework suggests, and what no mainstream publication has specifically rebutted, is that this pattern of ritual survival with deity replacement is not merely a curiosity of religious history, it is a functional failure. If the Emi were operational, then a ritual designed for Enki that is performed for Marduk is like a radio transmission on the correct frequency, but aimed at the wrong receiver. The signal goes out. No one is listening on the other end. Or, the wrong entity is listening. The ritual continues to feel meaningful to the participants because the form is preserved, the water is poured, the bread is broken, the procession proceeds through the gates, and the emotional and social functions of communal ceremony are fulfilled. But the operational function, the intended transmission, reaches no one. Consider the scale. The Akitu festival was performed annually in Babylon for over 1,000 years. From the rise of the Old Babylonian period, around 1800 BCE, through the fall of the Neo-Babylonian Empire in 539 BCE. After Cyrus conquered Babylon, elements of the festival persisted under Persian governance. After Alexander conquered Persia, elements of Mesopotamian ritual practice diffused through the Hellenistic world, carried by priests, scribes, and scholars who migrated to new cultural centers. The transmission routes are documented. Berossus, a Babylonian priest of Marduk, established a school of astrology on the Greek island of Kos around 280 BCE, transmitting Babylonian astronomical and ritual knowledge directly into the Hellenistic intellectual world. The astrological traditions of Babylon, which were deeply embedded in the Akitu calendar and its timing relative to the spring equinox, became foundational to Hellenistic and Roman astrology. The zodiacal system, the division of the year into 12 periods governed by celestial configurations, the association of specific rituals with specific astronomical events, all of this traveled from Babylon into the Mediterranean world through identifiable human vectors. The ritual marking of the new year at the equinox, with its ceremonies of purification and renewal, influenced the calendrical traditions of cultures that had no direct connection to Sumerian theology. Each time the form was adopted, the original addressee was further obscured. Each adoption added a new layer of theological reinterpretation over the same structural foundation. The ritual continued to function as a social and emotional experience. It continued to bind communities, mark time, and confer meaning. What it did not continue to do, if Sitchin's reading is correct, is reach the entity for whom it was originally designed. This is the implication that mainstream Assyriology has not addressed, not because the scholars are unaware of the Marduk transfer. They are the ones who documented it. Lambert spent decades on it. Jacobsen mapped it. Bottéro analyzed it. The transfer is established fact. What has not been addressed is the downstream question. If the rituals were operational rather than symbolic, then the transfer was not merely a change of name. It was a severing of function. And the rituals that descended from those Mesopotamian originals, carried through Persian, Hellenistic, Roman, and eventually monotheistic channels, would carry the same structural defect. They would preserve the form, they would address the wrong god, and they would continue to do so for thousands of years, performed by billions of people who have no idea that the ceremonies they repeat originated as addressed communications to specific Sumerian deities whose names were erased by a political theology composed in Babylon no later than 1100 BCE. The chain is traceable from Sumerian Enki to Babylonian Marduk, from Marduk to the syncretic deities of the Persian and Hellenistic periods. from those syncretic forms into the theological structures of the Abrahamic traditions, which inherited Mesopotamian ritual architecture along with Mesopotamian cosmology, Mesopotamian flood narratives, and Mesopotamian creation accounts. At each link in the chain, the form was preserved and the name was changed. The water rites of Enki became the baptismal rites of traditions that do not know Enki's name. The bread offerings of the Sumerian temple became the sacramental bread of traditions that do not know the Sumerian word ninda. The calendar rituals of the Akitu became the equinox festivals and New Year observances of traditions that have never heard of Ashurbanipal's library. At each link, the participants believed they were addressing the correct deity, and at each link, if the ME were operational, the transmission failed to reach the original recipient. The rituals are still performed, the water is still poured, the bread is still broken, the calendar is still marked at the equinox. The question is whether anyone is receiving the transmission, or whether the forms have become, in operational terms, empty signals broadcast on a frequency that no one is monitoring. The academic response to this line of questioning has been, in a word, silence. Not refutation, silence. There is a difference, and the difference matters. Refutation requires engaging with specific claims. It requires identifying the claim, examining the evidence presented for it, and demonstrating where the evidence fails or where the reasoning is flawed. Silence requires nothing. Silence is the default position of an institution that has decided a question is not worth asking. And when the question is whether the most significant ritual transfer in ancient Near Eastern history had functional, rather than merely symbolic consequences, the decision not to engage is not a neutral act. It is a judgment that forecloses inquiry. Lambert spent his career documenting the Marduk transfer. His work is meticulous, sourced, and universally respected within Assyriology. But Lambert's framework assumed that the transfer was entirely a matter of political theology. The gods were symbols of civic identity. The rituals were expressions of social organization. The transfer was a political act, like changing the name of a government ministry. At no point in Lambert's published work did he address the possibility that the rituals themselves had operational content that depended on the identity of the addressee. This is not a criticism of Lambert. It is a description of the framework within which he operated. The symbolic interpretation of Mesopotamian religion is the foundational assumption of modern Assyriology, and within that assumption, the operational question does not arise. It is not that the question was asked and answered. It is that the assumption made the question invisible. Jacobsen came closer. In The Treasures of Darkness, he described the Sumerian gods in terms that occasionally suggested functional specificity rather than pure symbolism. His analysis of Enki, in particular, emphasized the god's role as a craftsman, a problem solver, a figure whose intelligence was directed towards specific material outcomes. Jacobsen described Enki as the god who makes things work. But Jacobsen did not take the next step. He did not ask what happens when a ritual designed for the god who makes things work is redirected to a god who did not design the system. The question was there. The framework prevented it from being asked. Bottéro went further in a different direction. In Religion in Ancient Mesopotamia, he noted that the Mesopotamian ritual system was characterized by what he called an obsessive precision, an insistence on exact performance that went beyond what a purely symbolic system would require. If a ritual is symbolic, a slight variation in performance changes the aesthetics but not the outcome. But the Mesopotamian texts treat ritual error as catastrophic. A mispronounced incantation could bring disaster. An offering made at the wrong time could anger the gods rather than appease them. A procession that deviated from the prescribed route could void the entire ceremony. Bottéro noted this precision without explaining why a symbolic system would require it. In a functional system, the precision makes sense. A transmission that deviates from the correct parameters fails to reach its target. A procedure performed out of sequence produces the wrong result. The obsessive precision of Mesopotamian ritual is consistent with an operational interpretation. It is excessive for a symbolic one. This observation is in Bottéro's published work. The conclusion it implies is not. Oppenheim himself, in ancient Mesopotamia, made a statement that has become one of the most quoted lines in the field. He wrote that Mesopotamian religion should not be written. By this he meant that the Mesopotamian conception of the divine was so fundamentally different from modern Western religious frameworks that any attempt to describe it in modern terms would distort it. The statement is often read as scholarly humility. It can also be read as an admission that the available frameworks are inadequate. If Mesopotamian religion cannot be described using the symbolic categories of modern religious studies, then perhaps the symbolic categories are the wrong lens. Perhaps the Mesopotamians meant something different by their rituals than what modern scholars assume they meant. Oppenheim's warning has been cited thousands of times. Its implication has been followed almost never. The pattern repeats across the discipline. The evidence for operational interpretation exists in the mainstream scholarly record. It was documented by the mainstream scholars themselves. What does not exist is the analytical step that connects the evidence to the operational conclusion. And the reason that step has never been taken is not that the evidence is insufficient. It is that the step would require abandoning the foundational assumption. The symbolic framework is not merely a scholarly convention. It is the boundary between mainstream Assyriology and what the Academy calls pseudoscience. To suggest that Sumerian rituals had operational content, that the ME were functional rather than symbolic, that the identity of the divine addressee mattered in a way that transcends theology, is to cross that boundary. And crossing that boundary, regardless of the evidence, carries professional consequences. Sitchin crossed it. The professional consequences were predictable. His work was categorized as ancient astronaut theory, grouped with material of widely varying quality, and excluded from serious scholarly engagement. The categorization served as a substitute for analysis. Once the label was applied, no specific engagement was required. Reviewers did not need to address his ME interpretation because the label had already placed it outside the domain of legitimate inquiry. The phenomenon is not unique to Assyriology. Avi Loeb, the Frank B. Baird Jr. Professor of Science at Harvard University, has described a parallel dynamic in astrophysics. When Loeb published peer-reviewed papers suggesting that the interstellar object Oumuamua might be an artifact of non-natural origin, the response from portions of the astronomical community was not a competing analysis of the data, but a characterization of the hypothesis as unscientific. Loeb has documented this pattern in detail, describing how classification substitutes for engagement when a hypothesis crosses an institutional boundary. The mechanism is identical. This is not conspiracy. It is institutional behavior. Academic disciplines maintain boundaries, and the enforcement mechanism is not suppression but classification. Work that falls outside the accepted framework is not banned. It is categorized in a way that makes engagement unnecessary. The effect is the same. No doctoral student submits a dissertation proposing an operational reading of the ME because no advisor would approve it. No journal editor sends an operational ME paper to peer review because the reviewers would be selected from a pool that has already decided the question is not legitimate. No conference panel is convened to debate the operational interpretation because the debate is classified as belonging to a different category of discourse. The question goes unaddressed. The evidence sits in the mainstream record, documented by mainstream scholars, and the interpretive step that would connect it to the operational conclusion is never taken because taking it would require a researcher to accept the professional risk of crossing the boundary. Heiser engaged with Sitchin more directly than most mainstream scholars, and his critiques were often linguistically precise. When Sitchin mistranslated a specific Sumerian or Akkadian term, Heiser identified the error and documented the correct translation. This was legitimate and valuable scholarly work. But Heiser's engagement was selective. He addressed Sitchin's planetary interpretations and his etymology of specific divine names. He did not address the ME question. He did not publish a specific analysis of whether the ME system could support an operational reading. The most substantive mainstream engagement with Sitchin's work left the central question of this investigation untouched. The ME remained in the category of established fact, documented by Kramer, listed by Jacobsen, analyzed by Oppenheim, without any published argument for why they should be read as symbolic rather than operational. The symbolic reading is assumed. It is not argued for, and an assumption that is never argued for is an assumption that has never been tested. This is the gap. It is not a gap in the evidence. The evidence is in the British Museum. It is in the University of Pennsylvania Museum. It is in Kramer's translations and Lambert's analyses and Jacobsen's observations about Enki as the god who makes things work. The gap is in the willingness to ask whether the evidence supports a conclusion that the existing framework cannot accommodate. The asymmetry is worth stating plainly. To demonstrate that the ME are symbolic requires an argument. It requires showing that the specific operational details in the ME lists, the alloy compositions, the irrigation protocols, the astronomical calibrations, are literary conventions rather than functional descriptions. No such argument has been published. To demonstrate that the ME are operational requires showing that the details correspond to real procedures and that the identity of the operator is a necessary condition for the procedure's success. Sitchin attempted this argument. His attempt has been categorized rather than refuted. The result is a scholarly stalemate in which the operational interpretation has been proposed and dismissed, and the symbolic interpretation has been assumed and never defended. Neither side has won the argument because the argument has never been had. The mainstream has not engaged. The alternative has not been answered. And the rituals continue to be performed in forms that would be recognizable to a Sumerian priest, by billions of people who have never heard the word me and have no idea that the ceremonies they perform may have been designed for a god whose name was removed from the liturgy over 3,000 years ago. To understand how deeply the Sumerian ritual system was embedded in the physical and cosmological world of its creators, it is necessary to stand, at least in imagination, at the place where it began. Eridu sits at the edge of the southern Iraqi marshes, approximately 24 kilometers southwest of the modern city of Nasiriyah. In the 5th millennium BCE, it was a settlement at the boundary between the alluvial plain and the waters of the Persian Gulf, which extended much further inland than it does today. The temple of Enki sat at this boundary. It was, according to the Sumerian literary texts, the first temple ever built. The Sumerian king list, preserved on the Weld-Blundell prism held in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, names Eridu as the place where kingship first descended from heaven. Eridu was not merely old. It was, in Sumerian self-understanding, the origin point of civilization itself, and the god who resided there was Enki, the god of the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater ocean that the Sumerians believed sustained all life. The archaeological record at Eridu spans 18 distinct occupation levels, each one built directly on top of the last, each one preserving the same architectural orientation, each one slightly larger than the one below. The earliest level, level 18, dates to approximately 5,400 BCE. It was a small structure, roughly 3 meters square, with a niche for an offering table and traces of fish bones in the debris. Fish was sacred to Enki. That detail persists from the earliest level to the latest. Over 3,000 years of continuous occupation, the god never changed. The temple grew from a 3-meter room into a monumental complex, but the fish offerings, the water libations, and the orientation toward the Abzu never varied. It is one of the most remarkable examples of ritual continuity in the archaeological record of any civilization. The Abzu was not a metaphor, it was a physical reality. The southern Mesopotamian alluvium sits on a freshwater aquifer that, in the 5th and 4th millennia BCE, fed springs, marshes, and irrigation channels across the region. The Sumerians built their earliest settlements around these water sources. Eridu's temple was positioned directly above a spring. The water that flowed from beneath the temple was understood as a gift from Enki, a direct physical connection between the god's domain and the human world. The rituals performed at this site were water rituals. Libations were poured into the earth. Offerings were placed at the edge of the water. Incantations were spoken over the surface of the spring. And these rituals were not generic. They were addressed to Enki. They invoked his name. They described his attributes. They requested his specific intervention in matters related to water, wisdom, and the sustenance of human life. The form and the addressee were inseparable. The water was Enki's water. The ritual was Enki's ritual. The two were bound together by the physical geography of the site and by the theological framework that gave meaning to that geography. When the center of Mesopotamian power shifted northward, first to Uruk, then to Ur, then to Babylon, the water rites traveled with it, but they traveled without Eridu. They traveled without the Abzu spring. They traveled without the physical connection between the temple and the aquifer that had given the rituals their original context. In Babylon, the Akitu festival incorporated water rites that echoed the Eridu tradition, but the water was carried in vessels rather than drawn from a sacred spring. The god addressed was Marduk rather than Enki. The physical connection between the ritual and its geographic origin was severed. What remained was the form, the pouring. The invocation, the sequence, the smells of the ritual remained. The burning aromatics, the fermented grain. The textures remained, the wet clay of the temple floor, the rough surface of the offering vessel. The sounds remained, the chanted syllables, the rhythmic cadence of the incantation. Everything the senses could register was preserved. What was not preserved was the invisible connection, the intended recipient on the other end of the transmission. And the assumption was made, not consciously, not deliberately, but through the slow accumulation of theological revision, that the form was sufficient, that the sensory experience was the ritual, that the name at the top of the address was interchangeable. This assumption is worth examining because the Sumerian ritual tradition itself explicitly warns against it. The ritual texts do not support it. The texts consistently treat the identity of the divine addressee as a critical parameter. The Shurpu incantation series, a collection of magical and ritual texts used to cure illness and dispel evil, requires the practitioner to identify the correct deity for each specific affliction. An illness caused by the anger of Ishtar requires a different ritual addressee than an illness caused by the anger of Shamash. The texts do not suggest that any god will do. They insist on specificity, the right deity for the right affliction, the right ritual for the right deity. The system is calibrated. It is not interchangeable. The same principle applies to the temple cult. Each Sumerian city had a patron deity, and each patron deity received specific rituals that were not performed for other gods. The rituals of Enki at Eridu were different from the rituals of Inanna at Uruk, which were different from the rituals of Nanna the moon god at Ur, which were different from the rituals of Utu the sun god at Sippar. The differences were not merely aesthetic. They reflected different ME, different divine domains, different operational assignments. Enki's rituals involved water because water was Enki's ME. Inanna's rituals involved sexuality and warfare because those were Inanna's ME. Nanna's rituals involved the lunar calendar because the moon was Nanna's ME. The ritual system was modular, with each module calibrated to a specific divine operator. The priests of Enki were called Abgal, meaning Great One of the Abzu, and their training was specific to water rites. The priestesses of Inanna were called Naditu and En, and their roles included the sacred marriage and the management of Inanna's temple estates. The priests of Nanna at Ur maintained the lunar observation posts and calculated the calendar. Each priestly class was trained in the rituals of one deity. They were specialists. They did not rotate. An Abgal did not perform the rites of Inanna. An Naditu did not perform the rites of Enki. The specialization was built into the ME system. Each deity held different ME, and each set of ME required different ritual procedures, different training, and different personnel. The Sumerian king list records that kingship moved from city to city, and with each move, the patron deity of the new capital received the ritual prerogatives that came with political supremacy. When kingship was at Eridu, the rites were Enki's. When kingship moved to Bad Tibira, the rites shifted. When it moved to Sippar, to Shuruppak, to Kish, and eventually to Uruk and Ur, each transition brought a recalibration of the ritual calendar to the patron deity of the reigning city. The system was designed for modularity. Each module was deity-specific. The Marduk transfer collapsed these modules. It took the water rites of Enki, the celestial calculations of Anu, the storm powers of Enlil, and the fertility aspects of multiple goddesses, and placed them all under a single addressee, Marduk received everything. The rituals were no longer modular, they were unified under one name, but the procedures themselves still carried the structural signatures of their original addressees. A water rite designed for Enki still involved water. A celestial calculation designed for Anu still referenced the stars. A fertility rite designed for Inanna still involved the sacred marriage. The operational fingerprint of the original deities persisted inside the rituals even after the name on the address was changed. This is where the investigation moves from ancient Mesopotamia into the present. The structural elements of Sumerian ritual did not remain confined to the ancient Near East. They dispersed. They migrated through channels that are historically documented, carried by the same vectors that carried Mesopotamian astronomy, mathematics, law, and literature into the wider world. The Sumerian sexagesimal number system, base 60, survives in the 60 minutes of the modern hour and the 360 degrees of the modern circle. Sumerian legal concepts survive in modern contract law. Sumerian astronomical observations survive in the modern zodiac, and Sumerian ritual forms survive in religious practices that span the globe. The world that received these dispersed ritual forms was not a blank slate. The cultures that adopted Mesopotamian ritual elements already had their own traditions, their own deities, their own ceremonial practices. What happened when Mesopotamian forms arrived was not replacement, but layering. The incoming forms were absorbed into existing systems and reinterpreted through local theological frameworks. The result was a palimpsest, a document written over a document, in which the Sumerian original was buried beneath successive layers of theological revision. The original text is still there. It can still be read by those who know what to look for. But the surface text, the text that the modern practitioner reads, bears no visible trace of the original. It has been overwritten too many times. The dispersion was not accidental. It followed the same routes as trade, conquest, and cultural exchange. When Assyria conquered the Levant in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, Mesopotamian cultural practices traveled with the imperial administration. When Babylon conquered Judah in 586 BCE and deported its elite to Babylon, the exiled Judeans encountered Babylonian theology directly. The period of the Babylonian exile, approximately 586 to 538 BCE, is one of the most consequential in the history of Abrahamic religion. Mainstream biblical scholarship, including the work of scholars such as Israel Finkelstein and Neil Asher Silberman, has documented that significant portions of the Hebrew Bible were either composed or heavily edited during and after the exile. The creation narrative in Genesis, with its sequence of separating waters from land and creating humanity from earth, parallels the Sumerian creation accounts. The flood narrative in Genesis follows the structure of the Atrahasis and Gilgamesh flood stories with such precision that the literary dependence is not seriously disputed. The concept of a divine council, in which a supreme deity presides over an assembly of lesser divine beings, mirrors the Anunnaki council described in the Sumerian and Akkadian texts. The structure of temple worship, with its inner sanctum housing a divine image, its graduated zones of sanctity, and its system of daily offerings, parallels the Mesopotamian temple organization documented by Oppenheim. Even the architectural layout of Solomon's temple, as described in the Hebrew Bible, with its Holy of Holies, its approach courts, and its altar for burnt offerings, reflects Mesopotamian temple design principles that had been standardized for over 2,000 years before the first stone of the Jerusalem temple was laid. All of these elements show documented Mesopotamian influence. The influence is not disputed. What has not been asked, except by researchers outside the mainstream, is whether the ritual forms that traveled from Babylon into the emerging Judean tradition carried with them the structural blueprint of the Sumerian originals, and whether the identity of the original addressee traveled with the form or was lost in transmission. The evidence suggests it was lost. The water rites of Enki became, through layers of theological reinterpretation, the purification rituals of traditions that have no knowledge of Enki. The bread and beer offerings of the Sumerian temple became, through the same process, the sacramental meals of traditions that do not know the word Ninda. The sacred calendar of the Akitu, tied to the spring equinox, became the calendrical framework for festivals that have been assigned entirely different theological meanings. At each stage of transmission, the form was preserved because the form carried social, emotional, and institutional power. Communities organized their lives around these ceremonies. Identities were bound to them. Economies depended on the calendrical rhythms they established. The form had value independent of its original theological content, and so the form survived while the content was replaced, again and again, by the theological framework of whatever tradition adopted it. Consider a specific example. The Sumerian practice of ritual hand-washing before entering a sacred space is documented in temple texts from the 3rd millennium BCE. The practice required specific water, specific vessels, specific incantations, and was performed at the threshold of the temple precinct. It was a purification rite addressed to Enki, who controlled the purifying power of water. This practice traveled through Babylonian, Assyrian, and Persian channels into the Levant. It appears in the Hebrew Bible as a ritual requirement. It appears in later Abrahamic traditions as a specific ceremonial act performed before prayer. The form is remarkably consistent across 4,000 years and 3 continents: the water, the washing of hands, the threshold of the sacred space. The intention of purification, but the deity addressed is different in every tradition that practices it, and in most traditions that practice it today, no deity is addressed at all. The act has become a custom, the form has survived, the addressee has been forgotten entirely. The same pattern is visible in the use of incense. Sumerian temples burned aromatic resins as part of their ritual offerings, and the practice was specific to certain deities and certain occasions. The rising smoke was understood as a vehicle for carrying the offering to the divine realm. The practice traveled through Babylonian and Assyrian channels into the religious traditions of the Levant, the Mediterranean, and beyond. It is practiced today in churches, temples, mosques, and shrines across the world. The form is universal. The original addressee is unknown to the practitioners. The smoke still rises. Whether anyone receives it is a question that the ritual tradition no longer asks. The same holds for the consecration of sacred space. The Sumerian temple was not merely a building. It was a space that had been ritually activated through specific procedures addressed to the deity who would inhabit it. The foundation deposits at Eridu, small figurines and inscribed objects buried beneath the temple foundations, were addressed to Enki. They invoked his presence. They bound the physical structure to the divine occupant. When temples were built for other gods at other sites, the foundation deposits were addressed to the relevant deity. The practice was deity-specific. It traveled through Mesopotamian channels into later architectural traditions, where the consecration of sacred buildings persists in forms that echo the Sumerian originals: the laying of a cornerstone, the burial of objects beneath the foundation, the invocation of divine presence in a physical structure. The forms survive. The original deity-specific character of the consecration has been generalized beyond recognition. The 7-day ritual cycle is another thread in this tapestry. The Sumerian calendar was organized around lunar phases and included ceremonial periods of 7 days tied to specific divine observances. The number 7 held particular significance in Mesopotamian cosmology, associated with the 7 celestial bodies visible to the naked eye and the 7 great Anunnaki who sat in judgment. When the 7-day week entered the Levantine and Mediterranean traditions, it carried its Mesopotamian associations with it, though the divine assignments were reinterpreted. Each day of the modern week still bears the name of a celestial body, and the concept of a Sabbath, a sacred day of rest within a 7-day cycle, has Mesopotamian structural antecedents that predate its appearance in the Hebrew Bible by over 1,000 years. The form of the weekly cycle survives. Its original cosmological framework, rooted in the Anunnaki system of 7 presiding deities, has been replaced by theological frameworks that know nothing of the Anunnaki. The number 7 remains sacred. The reason it was sacred has been forgotten. Jacobsen would have recognized the structure. Bottéro would have recognized the transmission pathway. Lambert would have recognized the theological mechanism of absorption and replacement. The individual elements of this analysis are all present in mainstream scholarship. What is absent is the synthesis. No published work has traced the complete chain from Sumerian ritual to modern practice and asked the operational question at scale. Do the rituals still work? Were they ever intended to work in the way that the operational interpretation suggests? And if they were, does it matter that the billions of people who still perform variations of these ceremonies, pouring water, breaking bread, marking the calendar at the equinox, observing purification rites at the threshold of sacred space, are addressing those ceremonies to deities who were not the original recipients? The Sumerian texts suggest it matters enormously. The Atrahasis epic describes the creation of humanity as a deliberate act by Enki, performed for a specific purpose, with specific procedures, involving specific materials. Humanity was created to serve a function in the Anunnaki system. The rituals associated with that function were addressed to Enki because Enki was the designer. When the rituals were redirected to Marduk, the designer was removed from the loop. The instructions were still followed. The intended recipient no longer received them. And the question that no one has answered, in any peer-reviewed publication, in any doctoral dissertation, in any conference proceeding, is whether that removal matters. The temples at Eridu are ruins. The Abzu spring is dry. The Weld Blundell prism sits in its case at the Ashmolean. The Akitu tablets sit in the British Museum. The evidence is available. The question remains open. And every day, in every tradition that traces its ritual ancestry, however distantly, to the ancient Near East, the ceremonies continue. The water is poured, the bread is broken, the incense rises, the calendar turns at the equinox, the sacred spaces are consecrated. The forms are ancient, the names are new, and the original recipients, the specific Sumerian deities for whom each ceremony was calibrated, each offering prepared, each invocation composed, are absent from the transaction. They have been absent for over 3,000 years. The rituals do not know this. The practitioners do not know this. The forms persist because forms are resilient, names are not. The pattern visible in Mesopotamia is not confined to Mesopotamia. Across independently developed civilizations, on continents that had no documented contact with one another during the relevant periods, the same structural phenomenon appears. Rituals that were originally designed for specific divine recipients are preserved in form after the identity of the recipient changes, is obscured, or is lost entirely. And in several of these traditions, the consequences of addressing a ritual to the wrong deity are explicitly described, not as a minor error, but as a fundamental violation of the system's operating logic. The Rig Veda, the oldest of the four Vedas and the foundational text of the Hindu ritual tradition, was composed between approximately 1500 and 1200 BCE, making it roughly contemporaneous with the period of the Marduk theological transfer in Mesopotamia. There is no evidence of direct textual contact between the two traditions during this period, though both may draw on earlier shared cultural substrates from the 3rd millennium BCE. The Rig Veda prescribes a system of sacrificial ritual called yajna that is characterized by an insistence on precision that matches and in some respects exceeds the Mesopotamian system. The Vedic ritual requires that the correct deity be invoked with the correct mantra, in the correct meter, at the correct astronomical moment, with the correct offerings, placed in the correct position relative to the sacrificial fire. Any deviation is classified as a dosha, a ritual fault, and the tradition explicitly states that a dosha can reverse the intended effect of the ritual, transforming a blessing into a curse, a healing into a harm. The Brahmana texts, the prose commentaries on the Vedas composed between approximately 900 and 700 BCE, contain detailed accounts of rituals that failed because the wrong deity was invoked. These are not theoretical warnings, they are case studies. The Shatapatha Brahmana describes a sacrifice that was intended for Prajapati, the lord of creatures, but was incorrectly directed to Rudra, the god of storms and destruction. The result, according to the text, was not a neutral failure, but an active catastrophe. The ritual's power was released but received by the wrong entity, producing effects opposite to those intended. The Vedic tradition developed an entire class of corrective rituals called prayashchitta, atonement ceremonies, designed to undo the damage caused by ritual misdirection. The existence of corrective rituals implies that misdirection was understood as a real and recurring problem, not a theoretical impossibility. The identity of the divine addressee is not interchangeable. Agni receives fire offerings, Soma receives the pressed plant offering, Indra receives the warrior's praise, Varuna receives the oaths and the judgments. Each deity has a specific ritual protocol, and performing one deity's protocol while addressing another deity is not merely ineffective, it is dangerous. The Vedic tradition preserves a concept that mainstream Assyriology has never applied to the Mesopotamian material: the concept that a ritual aimed at the wrong god is worse than no ritual at all. The parallel is striking because it is structural rather than superficial. Both the Sumerian and the Vedic traditions treat the ritual system as modular and deity-specific. Both insist on precision in the invocation. Both assign catastrophic consequences to misdirection. And both traditions experienced historical episodes in which deity assignments were reorganized. In the Vedic case, the rise of Vishnu and Shiva during the post-Vedic period led to a gradual absorption of older Vedic deities' ritual functions by the newer supreme deities of the developing Hindu traditions. Indra, once the king of the gods in the Rig Veda, was demoted to a lesser position. His rituals did not disappear. They were reassigned or reinterpreted. The Vedic tradition is more explicit than the Mesopotamian about the risk this poses. The older commentaries warn against conflating the rites of one deity with those of another. The warnings suggest an awareness that the form of the ritual is not self-sufficient, that the identity of the recipient is a structural component. The Yoruba Ifá tradition of West Africa preserves a parallel system with even greater specificity. The Orisha, the divine beings of Yoruba cosmology, each govern specific domains and each require specific ritual protocols. Ocean receives offerings of honey, cinnamon, oranges, and river water. Shango receives offerings of red palm oil, okra, and fire. Yemoja receives offerings tied to the ocean and to motherhood. The protocols are not interchangeable. An offering prepared for Oshun and directed to Shango would be considered not merely a waste but an offense. The Ifá divination system, maintained by a priestly class called Babalawo, includes specific procedures for determining which Orisha has been offended by misdirected ritual and what corrective ceremonies must be performed. The Babalawo undergo a minimum of 10 years of training, during which they memorize over 256 Odu, the binary divination figures that encode the entire Yoruba knowledge system. Each Odu contains specific prescriptions for which Orisha must be addressed for which situation. The system does not allow improvisation. It does not allow substitution. The correct Orisha for the correct situation is determined by divination, not by the preference of the practitioner. And when the divination indicates that an Orisha has received offerings meant for another, the corrective procedure is elaborate, costly, and urgent. The system is built on the assumption that the identity of the divine recipient is not a detail, it is the operating parameter. The form without the correct addressee is not neutral, it is a malfunction. The Book of Enoch, preserved in the Ethiopian Orthodox canon and dated in its earliest sections to approximately the 3rd century BCE, describes a related but distinct phenomenon. The Watchers, a class of divine beings who descended to earth and taught humanity specific arts and rituals, are removed from the earth as punishment for their transgressions, but the arts they taught and the rituals they established do not leave with them. Humanity continues to perform the rites the Watchers initiated, but the Watchers are no longer present to receive them. The Book of Enoch does not use the language of ritual misdirection, it uses the language of absence. The teachers are gone, the teachings remain, the rituals continue without the beings who designed them. The structural parallel to the Mesopotamian case is direct. The Anunnaki, in Sitchin's reading, established the ME and the associated rituals. When the Anunnaki departed, or were replaced, the rituals continued. The recipients were absent. The transmissions went unanswered. The Popol Vuh, the creation narrative of the Quiche Maya, recorded in the 16th century CE from oral traditions of much greater antiquity, describes a sequence of creation attempts in which earlier gods' works are overwritten by later divine acts. The gods of the first creation are not destroyed, they are displaced. Their works persist in altered form, governed by new divine authorities who did not design them. The Popol Vuh does not explicitly address the question of whether rituals directed at the new gods reach the old ones, but it preserves the structural pattern. Creation is layered. Earlier divine works underlie later ones. The surface bears the name of the current authority. The infrastructure belongs to the previous one. The Dogon people of Mali, in their cosmological traditions documented by the French anthropologist Marcel Griaule in the 1930s and 40s, describe beings called the Nommo, who came from the sky and established the rites and structures of Dogon civilization. The Nommo are associated with water, with agriculture, and with the transmission of specific knowledge. The rites they established are still performed. The Nommo are no longer present. The Dogon tradition, like the Book of Enoch, preserves the concept of rituals that outlast their originators. The forms are maintained with precision. The beings for whom the forms were designed are absent. The Dogon do not claim that the rituals have lost their power. They maintain that the forms themselves carry the power. But they also maintain that the Nommo will return, and when they do, the rituals will once again reach their intended recipients. The implication is clear. Until the return, the rituals operate in a state of suspension. The signal is broadcast. The receiver is away. 6 traditions, 6 continents, 6 independent attestations of the same structural phenomenon. Rituals designed for specific divine entities that persist after the identity of those entities is changed, obscured, or removed. And in at least 3 of those traditions, the Vedic, the Yoruba, and the Sumerian, the consequences of addressing a ritual to the wrong deity are described as catastrophic. This is not a pattern that can be explained by diffusion alone. The Yoruba and Dogon traditions have no documented contact with Mesopotamia. The Quiche Maya had no contact with any Old World tradition during the period when their cosmological system was developing. The convergence is structural. It suggests that the concept of ritual misdirection is not a Sumerian peculiarity. It is a feature recognized independently by multiple civilizations that developed sophisticated ritual systems. Each of these civilizations arrived at the same conclusion through its own experience, its own theological framework, its own encounters with the consequences of ritual error. The Vedic priests did not learn from the Sumerians that the wrong deity means a failed ritual. The Yoruba Babalawo did not consult Mesopotamian tablets before establishing their protocols for corrective sacrifice. These systems developed their understanding of deity-specific ritual independently, and they converged on the same structural principle. When independent systems converge on the same finding, the finding warrants examination rather than dismissal. The question that none of these traditions has abandoned, and that only modern academic scholarship has declared irrelevant, is whether the identity of the divine recipient matters. The strongest objection to this entire framework comes not from the cross-cultural evidence, which tends to support the specificity of divine address, but from the philosophical question at the foundation. The objection is this: even if the ME were operational, even if the rituals were designed for specific recipients, and even if the Marduk transfer constituted a misdirection, there is no mechanism by which a ritual can reach a deity. The objection is not about which god receives the ritual. It is about whether any god receives any ritual. The materialist position, which underlies the symbolic interpretation of mainstream Assyriology, holds that rituals are social and psychological practices. They function by affecting the participants, not by transmitting anything to a divine recipient. In this view, the question of the correct addressee is meaningless, because there is no addressee. There is only the community performing the ritual, and the ritual functions by reinforcing social bonds, marking temporal cycles, and providing a shared framework of meaning. The form is everything, because the form is all there is. The recipient is irrelevant, because there is no recipient. This is not a fringe materialist position. It is the operating assumption of the social sciences as applied to religion. Emile Durkheim, one of the founders of modern sociology, argued in the early 20th century that religious rituals function primarily as mechanisms of social cohesion. The sacred, in Durkheim's framework, is a projection of the community onto the cosmos. The gods are symbols of collective identity. The rituals are performances that reinforce group solidarity. In this framework, the Marduk transfer is simply one community's symbols replacing another's, the way a corporate merger replaces one logo with another. The underlying function, social cohesion, continues regardless of which symbol sits at the top. This objection should be taken seriously because it represents the most intellectually rigorous challenge to the operational interpretation. It does not rely on dismissing Sitchin as pseudoscientific. It does not rely on institutional boundary enforcement. It rests on a philosophical commitment that the divine is not a real entity that receives transmissions, and therefore the question of correct address is incoherent. If there is no receiver, there is no wrong receiver. The ritual cannot be misdirected because it was never directed in the first place. The counterargument is twofold. First, the materialist position does not explain the obsessive precision of the ancient ritual systems. If rituals function purely as social and psychological practices, then approximate performance should be sufficient. A slightly different sequence, a slightly different invocation, a slightly different offering should produce the same social and psychological effects. But the ancient traditions, Sumerian, Vedic, and Yoruba alike, insist that slight deviations produce catastrophically different results. This insistence is consistent with an operational system and inconsistent with a purely symbolic one. Social rituals are forgiving. Technical procedures are not. Second, the materialist position assumes its conclusion. It begins with the premise that there is no divine recipient, and derives from that premise the conclusion that the identity of the divine recipient does not matter. This is logically valid, but not empirically established. No experiment has demonstrated that ritual transmissions do not reach a recipient. No study has been designed to test the hypothesis, because the hypothesis is excluded from the domain of testable claims by the prevailing framework. The assumption is metaphysical, not scientific. It is a belief about the nature of reality, not a finding. The irony is considerable. A scholarly tradition that prides itself on empiricism has adopted a metaphysical starting point that it has never subjected to empirical scrutiny. The operational interpretation is dismissed as unfalsifiable. The symbolic interpretation is assumed without acknowledging that it too rests on an unfalsifiable metaphysical claim, the claim that no divine entity receives ritual transmissions. Both positions are, in strict epistemological terms, faith-based. The difference is that one is aware of its faith and the other is not. And it is precisely this assumption that has prevented mainstream scholarship from asking the operational question. The assumption is not a discovery, it is a starting point, and starting points can be wrong. The state of the debate, honestly assessed, is this. The operational interpretation of the ME and the Sumerian ritual system has been proposed by Sitchin and has not been specifically refuted. The symbolic interpretation has been assumed by mainstream Assyriology and has not been specifically argued for. The cross-cultural evidence supports the claim that multiple independent civilizations treated the identity of the divine addressee as an essential parameter of ritual function. The materialist objection rests on a metaphysical assumption that has not been empirically tested. The question remains genuinely unresolved. Neither side has won because neither side has fully engaged, and in the meantime, the rituals continue. If the operational interpretation is substantially correct, then what is at stake is not merely the history of religion, it is the present. The conventional timeline of religious history would require significant revision. The standard narrative holds that ritual forms evolved organically, adapting to changing theological contexts through natural processes of cultural development. The operational interpretation suggests instead that a specific, documented, historically datable event, the Marduk theological transfer of the 2nd millennium BCE, constituted a deliberate intervention in the ritual infrastructure of human civilization. The Enuma Elish was not a gradual evolution. It was a charter document, composed at a specific time, for a specific political purpose, with specific theological consequences. If the ME were operational, then the Enuma Elish was not merely a myth, It was the document that broke the connection between humanity's ritual practices and their intended recipients, and the break was permanent. No subsequent theological revision restored the original addressees. No later tradition recovered the names that were erased. The revision was total. It would mean that billions of people, across dozens of traditions, on every inhabited continent, are performing ceremonies that carry the structural blueprint of Sumerian originals. Ceremonies that were designed for specific Anunnaki gods. Ceremonies whose forms have been preserved with remarkable fidelity across 4,000 years of transmission, and that every one of those ceremonies is addressed to the wrong recipient. It would mean that the Marduk theological transfer, documented by Lambert, Jacobsen and Bottéro as a political event in the 2nd millennium BCE, was not merely a historical curiosity. It was the moment when the world's ritual infrastructure was permanently misdirected. The forms survived, the function was severed, and the severance was so complete, so thoroughly buried under successive layers of theological revision, that the practitioners have no idea it occurred. They pour the water, they break the bread, they mark the calendar at the equinox. They consecrate their sacred spaces with ceremonies whose deepest structural elements trace back to temples at the edge of the Mesopotamian marshes. They do not know that the water was originally Enki's. They do not know that the bread was originally Ninkasi's. They do not know that the calendar was originally calibrated to the Akitu. They know only the form. The form is all that was transmitted. The name was erased. And if the name was the operating parameter, then the form, however beautiful, however ancient, however deeply felt, is a signal that reaches no one. The ritual tablets are in the British Museum. They are in the Mesopotamian Gallery, in the collection from the Library of Ashurbanipal. The Weld Blundell prism is in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. The Enuma Elish tablets, which document the transfer of divine authority from the older gods to Marduk, are available to any researcher who wants to read them. Sitchin published his reading of the ME in the 12th Planet in 1976. Lambert published his documentation of the Marduk transfer across multiple works spanning 4 decades, culminating in Babylonian creation myths in 2013. Jacobsen published The Treasures of Darkness in 1976. Kramer published his translation of Enki and the World Order and his catalogue of the ME in multiple editions throughout the second half of the 20th century. The sources are published, the artifacts are in their cases, the rituals are still performed, every day, in every tradition that inherited the forms without inheriting the names. Whether those rituals reach anyone, whether they ever reached anyone, whether the identity of the addressee was an essential operating parameter or an irrelevant theological label, is a question that has been open since Henry Layard dug the first tablets out of the ruins of Nineveh in the 1840s. It is still open now.